you gotta understand, for an engineer, this is the most depressing thought you can imagine. Right? Not whether I should have done the download page. I mean, we could argue about what the minimum viable product really should have been. But forget that. The fact that I could even ask the question about whether the code I wrote constituted progress for the company was like, hitting me really where it hurts. Right? Because my whole identity as a functional expert was that I write good code. And so a day I spend writing good code is a good day. And the whole time we were busy failing at this first strategy and having to pivot, I wasn't even asking the right question. That's the thing that I found frustrating. And that was kind of a first very depressing experience that kicked me on the road to Lean Startup. I mentioned this idea that it's actually learning which is the unit of progress. Right? Unlike in general management where learning gets you fired, here learning is the point. It's writing code that should get you fired if it gets in the way of learning. Now we'll deal with an issue, right? People who have the power of the reality distortion field can convince anybody they learned anything. That's why we call it validated learning in the spirit of science, right? Conducting experiments and having proof that actually, not just what we did before was wrong, but we've learned something and therefore what we do next actually will work. Which is really, this is the heart of the Lean Startup theory. This is kind of a simplified version. What is a software company? It is a catalyst which turns ideas into code. Okay, anything else it does is a fascinating side effect. When customers interact with that code, you can measure what happens and generate data if you want. And if you're really smart, you can choose to learn something influencing your next set of ideas from that data. Okay, it's a very simple three-stage feedback loop. But it's actually a very powerful diagram. Because first of all, it allows us to put the concept of a pivot on a more firm foundation. A pivot is one full turn through this feedback loop, right? A major iteration. And secondly, it gives us this heuristic at the top. This is all of the tactics and specific practices from Lean Startup that we recommend all have this character. They help you minimize your total time through this feedback loop. Because what matters in entrepreneurship is not how well are you building things, how beautiful is your code, how many things did you measure, how much data do you have, or even how much learning do you do at the whiteboard moving boxes and arrows around. Right? What matters is how fast can you get through this full loop. And the thing that's so hard, the reason I spend so much time on this theory rather than telling you, hey, if you just adopt this practice, if you just start doing continuous deployment, everything will be fine. Because all of these practices drive actual practitioners crazy. Because all of us have been trained in the only management paradigm that existed before. Namely the one that says, if you're good at building things, if you're good at your functional excellence, you are making progress. And as soon as we move into a system where we're optimizing total time to the loop, any of you who've taken even Systems Theory 101 will know, we necessarily sub-optimize each of the individual stages. So actually, Lean Startup is about making programmers and data warehousing people, marketers, business, everybody in your company less efficient. Because we will make your company more efficient, and not more efficient at making stuff, at doing the full loop. This actually is a really useful heuristic for answering those unanswerable questions that co-founders waste inordinate amount of time arguing about. Have you ever have those arguments that go around and around in circles and just can never seem to resolve, should we invest more in infrastructure or less in infrastructure? Should our software be more scalable or less scalable? Should we do more design before we launch or less design and launch sooner? Any of these questions sound familiar to any of you? I mean, when I was an entrepreneur actually doing it, this is what I spent my day doing, right? Maybe 4 hours coding, 4 hours arguing about whether some bug needed to be fixed, arguing about whether some design needed to be improved or not. Because under the kind of framework of general management, those questions cannot be answered. There's no right answer. It's well, maybe do a little bit of both, because you can always find some examples, but for any piece of advice you give me, I can find you an example of someone who did that and was successful, someone who did it and failed, someone who didn't do it and was successful, and someone who didn't do it and failed. There's so many examples, there's so many startups. We can find every possible anecdote to argue from. Of course, that's what we would do. So it's well, Steve Jobs did it. No, well, Bill Gates did something else. Oh, great, right? Do I want to be more like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates? I guess today the flavor of the month is Steve Jobs, but that's not actually a helpful framework. So this is actually what I believe to be a more rigorous way of answering those questions. If it gets us through the loop faster, it means we're making progress. If not, we were wasting our time. There is a ton more to Lean Startup, but I actually don't want to go into all of the specific tactics. If you want to read about it online, everything up here, probably the famous ones are minimum viable product, continuous deployment, an emphasis on split testing, design, usability tests. But that's actually not the interesting part. Because if you don't get the mindset right, you won't be able to actually implement any of those things. So since we only have limited time tonight, I would actually rather us spend some more time in a discussion, have some Q&A. So I'm going to pause and just remind you what the stakes are. Most of you right now are busy wasting people's time. And I know you don't think that you are, But my goal is to at least plant that seed of doubt. Is what we're doing today, what we're doing tomorrow, actually a good use of time? And so with that, I will say thank you very much and take some questions. So thanks.
Any questions for Eric?
Yeah.
Yeah. The bit I don't really understand is scientific management is pro-optimization. It's absolutely pro-optimization. All the Harvard stuff from the 50s and 60s is built on top of it. The whole MBA mindset, not the MBA itself, is entirely built on top of that.
Listen, some of my best friends are MBAs.
None of mine are. So, but what you're proposing really is anti-optimization in almost every sense. So how can you really claim parentage from it when it's just so diametrically opposite?
Yeah. So the question is, it's a wise question. Scientific management and each of these previous management paradigms were fundamentally about optimization. And it sounds like what I am is against optimization. So how can I claim parentage from pro-optimization if I'm anti-optimization? The thing you have to understand is that every management paradigm, every scientific paradigm period, is birthed out of the success of a previous paradigm. The reason there are so many entrepreneurs in the world today, I mean, there are more entrepreneurs practicing right now than have ever existed at any previous time in history. And the reason is because the previous management paradigm was so successful in producing so much material abundance that we get to play with it. But that same success of the previous paradigm is what planted the seeds of its own undoing. Right? The problem is we have too much stuff, we don't know what to do with it. So this paradigm embraces everything that came before. It's not that like lean production is bad. In fact, when startups become large companies, they start to do an awful lot of lean production. Because once we actually figure out who the customer is, then we want to start optimizing in the same way that any company does. Although, interestingly, a lot of large companies are trying to figure out how to do this lean startup thing. Because of course, in today's market, you can't just sit on a great product and reap that monopoly for decades. The window of time, whole industries are coming and going in a decade. So the way I would answer the question specifically about optimization is, each management paradigm has changed not whether we should optimize or not whether we should be efficient or not, but how should we measure our efficiency? Right? In the original factories, efficiency was measured by, are we keeping everybody busy? And the inside of lean was, it doesn't matter if we're keeping everybody busy, it matters if we're satisfying the customer. What we want to do is take that to a new kind of optimization, not are we satisfying the customer, but are we discovering who the customer is, so that we can then satisfy them efficiently. So our optimization is still that build, measure, learn feedback loop. It's just we're optimizing to a different unit of progress. Does that answer? Okay. Well, maybe we can get the rest of the question after, but let's get somebody else. Yeah.
A lot of what we're a lot of what we're talking about seems to be focused around consumer internet, particularly with gathering data. You need a lot of. It really works well if you've got a large volume of data. Is anybody spreading this, or who's spreading this to different areas, particularly where there isn't that volume of data?
Mm-hmm. You have one in mind, hypothetically speaking.
Well, I guess business to business
Sure.
to mind.
Yeah, sure. The question is, this sounds like a lot of consumer internet, but what about business to business? What about other industries? The funny thing about this is, these startups started out as an idea that was like so dumb people would laugh when you even speak it out loud, and now it's become this global phenomenon. And so we have, hundreds, probably thousands of practitioners now who have tried to apply these ideas in a lot of different domains. So the short answer is yes, it's being applied in a lot of places. Business to business, like enterprise software, is not even the most complicated domain. Steve Blank, who I showed a picture of before, who invented customer development, I used to sit in classes of his, and come talk about InView at his class, because he used to get questions that were like, well, yeah, because his background's enterprise software. So he would literally get the question, well, sure, obviously this is going to work in enterprise software, but what about consumer internet? Because our assumption is always that wherever an idea originated, that's where it's well suited, which is actually not a bad, not a bad assumption to have. But none of the specific principles that I'm trying to teach really have anything to do with industry structure at all. And therefore, they work really well across industries. In fact, that was the whole rationale for doing this in the first place. The problem I had as an entrepreneur, both as an advisor, as an investor, and as a practitioner, was you constantly get this advice of something that worked for somebody in some industry at some time in the past. And you're asked to answer, well, will it work for me in my industry in the present? And at the level of practices and tips and tricks, there's no way to translate. But I think in the realm of principles, you can. So you can say, well, what's the principle behind that? Does that principle apply to me? doesn't work. And so to me is